Tokyo, Japan, December 2000. As the final days of the 20th century slipped away, millions of people across Japan were preparing for the arrival of a new year. For many countries, New Year's Eve is a celebration. In Japan, it is something deeper, a period of reflection, a time for family. Homes are cleansed, businesses closed, relatives travel long distances to be together. Temples prepare for midnight ceremonies as the old year gives way to the new. It is a season associated with renewal, with endings, and with beginnings. In the western suburbs of Tokyo, life was moving to that familiar rhythm. Families shopped for holiday food, children enjoyed the start of their winter break, neighbours exchanged greetings, and in a quiet corner of Setagaya Ward, one family was preparing to spend another new year together. They never got the chance, because on the night of the 30th December 2000, 4 members of the same family were murdered inside their home. More than 2 decades later, nobody has ever been arrested. No suspects have been identified, and despite one of the largest investigations in Japanese history, the question at the heart of the case remains unanswered. Who entered the Miyazawa home that night? And how did they seemingly vanish without a trace? Setagaya is one of Tokyo's largest wards. Today it is home to almost 1 million people. Yet despite its size, much of the district retains a distinctly residential character. Tree-lined streets, schools, local businesses, parks scattered among family homes. At the turn of the millennium, it was not considered a place associated with violent crime. The neighbourhood surrounding Soshigaya Park was particularly quiet. It was the sort of place where routines rarely changed. People recognised familiar faces, children played outdoors, families settled into lives built around ordinary concerns. Work, school, home. The Miyazawas were one such family. 44-year-old Miko Miyazawa lived in a modest house overlooking the park with his wife Yashuko and their 2 children. Friends and colleagues described him as thoughtful and dependable. He worked for a foreign-affiliated company involved in the theatre industry and was regarded as intelligent and hard-working. His wife Yashuko was 41. Much of her attention was focused on raising their children and maintaining family life. Their daughter Nina was 8 years old, bright, energetic and creative. She enjoyed drawing and artistic activities. Their son Ray was 6. He had developmental difficulties and required additional support. Those who knew the family often remarked on the patience and dedication shown by his parents. Nothing about the Miyazawas suggested they would become the subjects of international headlines. They were not wealthy, they were not famous, they were not involved in public disputes. By every account, they were simply a family living an ordinary life. And perhaps that is one reason the case continues to resonate. There is no obvious narrative, no dramatic warning signs, no known chain of events leading inevitably toward tragedy. Only a family. And then an act of violence so extreme that investigators are still trying to understand it more than 25 years later. The area around the house had changed considerably during the years before the murders. A redevelopment project had transformed part of the neighbourhood. Several nearby properties had already been demolished. Empty lots appeared where houses once stood. Construction work had altered sightlines and pedestrian routes. The result was a strangely fragmented landscape. Occupied homes stood beside cleared ground. Some streets felt quieter than they once had. Investigators would later spend considerable time examining whether these changes played any role in the crime. The house itself stood near Soshigaya Park. Behind it were trees and walking paths. Someone familiar with the area could move through parts of the neighbourhood without attracting much attention. Whether that mattered remains one of the many unanswered questions. At the time, however, nobody considered it significant. The Miyazawas had no reason to believe they were in danger. Saturday the 30th of December began normally. The family spent time together and prepared for the approaching New Year holiday. At some point, Yoshiko spoke with her mother, Haruko. Nothing about the conversation suggested concern. Nothing indicated it would be their final exchange. As evening fell, the neighbourhood gradually became quieter. Lights switched on behind curtains. Families settled indoors. The temperature dropped as winter tightened its grip on the city. Somewhere, during those hours, an intruder approached the Miyazawa home. Exactly when remains uncertain, but investigators believe the offender entered after dark. The route they chose was unusual. Rather than using a door, evidence suggested they approached from the rear of the property. Near the house stood a tree, and investigators later concluded that the offender likely climbed this tree before accessing a second-floor bathroom window. The route required agility. It also required commitment. This was not the easiest way into the house, nor was it the quickest. It was, however, one that offered concealment. Whether the offender had planned the entry in advance or selected it opportunistically remains unknown. But once inside, events unfolded rapidly. Because there were no surviving witnesses, investigators had to reconstruct the attack through forensic evidence. What emerged was not a perfect timeline, but it provided a probable sequence of events. Investigators believe 6-year-old Ray may have been the first family member encountered by the murderer. Evidence suggested an attack occurred upstairs. Noise from the confrontation may have alerted the rest of the household. If so, the situation escalated quickly. The violence appears to have moved through the house as family members became aware of the intruder's presence. At some point, Miko confronted the offender. This confrontation would become one of the most important moments in the entire case. Evidence indicated a fierce struggle. Unlike many attacks where victims are overwhelmed immediately, Miko appears to have fought back. The encounter was violent enough to damage the attacker's weapon. During the struggle, the blade broke. Part of the knife remained lodged in Miko's body. For investigators, this discovery was significant, not only because it helped reconstruct the attack, but because it revealed something about the offender. Their original weapon had failed. Their plan, whatever it may have been, had encountered a serious obstacle. Yet they did not flee. Instead, they adapted. A second knife was taken from inside the house, and the attack continued. This detail would later influence behavioral profiling. Many investigators concluded that the offender demonstrated determination and persistence rather than panic. Even after suffering setbacks, they continued moving through the house. The violence eventually claimed all 4 members of the family. By the time it ended, nobody remained alive inside the home. And yet, astonishingly, the mystery was only beginning. The following morning, concerns began to grow. Yasuko's mother, Haruko, was unable to contact the family. Repeated attempts went unanswered. Eventually, she decided to visit the house herself. What she discovered remains one of the most heartbreaking moments in the entire case. Inside the home, she found evidence of a catastrophe. Yasuko and Nina were discovered first. Realizing something was terribly wrong, she contacted emergency services. Police and paramedics rushed to the scene. As officers moved through the property, the full scale of the tragedy became apparent. Miko was found on the ground floor. Ray was found upstairs. 4 members of the same family had been killed. For experienced investigators, the scene was shocking, not only because of the violence involved, but because of what they began to discover afterwards. Initially, police expected a familiar pattern. An offender enters, a crime occurs, the offender leaves. But the evidence inside the Miyazawa residence suggested something entirely different. Because according to the forensic evidence, the person responsible did not leave immediately. In fact, they may have remained inside the house for a considerable period of time. As crime scene technicians began documenting the property, they found fingerprints, blood, footwear impressions, personal belongings, clothing, biological evidence. The offender had left behind an extraordinary amount of material, far more than investigators would normally expect. In many homicide investigations, detectives struggled to find evidence. In Setagaya, they found themselves facing the opposite problem. The evidence was everywhere, and the deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Because the murders themselves were only the first mystery. What the offender appears to have done afterwards would transform the case into one of the most baffling investigations in modern Japanese history. When detectives began the painstaking process of examining the Miyazawa residence, they quickly realized they were dealing with something unlike any crime scene they had encountered before. At first glance, the murders themselves were shocking enough. An entire family had been killed inside their own home. But as investigators worked through the evidence room by room, a second mystery began to emerge, because the person responsible appeared to have done something most killers never do. They stayed. Not for a few minutes, not simply long enough to gather belongings or remove evidence, but long enough to leave behind a detailed record of their movements. And that record would become one of the strangest aspects of the entire case. For investigators, understanding what happened after the murders became almost as important as understanding the murders themselves, because whoever had entered that house appeared to behave in ways that defied conventional expectations. The crime itself suggested violence and urgency. The behavior afterwards, well, that suggested patience, a kind of almost comfort, and trying to reconcile those two things would occupy detectives for years. One of the first conclusions investigators reached was that the offender had been injured during the attack. The struggle with Miko Miyazawa had not gone entirely according to plan. Evidence showed that Miko had fought back hard, and during that confrontation the attacker's knife broke. Part of the blade remained lodged in Miko's body. The offender was forced to abandon the damaged weapon and arm themselves with another knife found inside the house. But the broken blade was only part of the story. The blood found throughout the residence indicated the attacker had also suffered an injury, and the amount of blood left behind suggested more than a superficial cut. This was not a small nick to the hand. This was a wound significant enough to leave traces in multiple locations. Immediately, investigators recognized the importance of this discovery. An injured offender is often easier to identify than an uninjured one. Serious wounds require treatment, and people notice them. Doctors remember them. Friends and family ask questions, and in many investigations, injuries become the thread that eventually leads police to a suspect. For a brief period, detectives believed this inquiry might provide exactly the breakthrough they needed. Instead, it became another dead end. As forensic teams continued documenting the house, they discovered evidence suggesting the offender had remained inside long after the violence had ended. This conclusion stunned investigators. Most offenders would flee as quickly as possible. Every additional minute spent at a crime scene increases their risk. A neighbour might return home, a relative might visit unexpectedly, a passerby might notice movement. The safest option is usually immediate escape. Yet the evidence inside the Miyazawa residence suggested something entirely different. The offender appeared to move through the house almost casually. Food belonging to the family had been consumed. Tea had apparently been prepared. The bathroom had been used. Personal items had been handled. Objects moved. The longer investigators examined the scene, the more unsettling the picture became. This was not the behavior of somebody desperate to escape. It was the behavior of someone acting as though they had time. And that distinction mattered, because it raised a troubling question. Did the offenders simply feel safe? Or did they know something that investigators did not? The food became one of the most frequently discussed details in the entire case. Evidence suggested that the offender had eaten ice cream from the family's refrigerator. Melon was also believed to have been consumed. On paper, these details seem insignificant, but in context, they were deeply disturbing. 4 people had been killed. The offender had suffered an injury, and yet at some point afterwards, they stopped to eat. The act itself appeared almost mundane, ordinary even, which made it all the more difficult to understand. Investigators spent years debating what this behavior revealed. Some believed it suggested confidence. Others interpreted it as emotional detachment. Still, others argued that it reflected a degree of psychological disorganization. No consensus ever emerged, but the image remained difficult to ignore. A killer moving through the home of a murdered family, helping themselves to food while surrounded by the aftermath of their actions. It is one of the details that continues to unsettle people even today. The bathroom evidence raised similar questions. Investigators concluded that the offender had used the facilities within the house after the attacks. Again, this indicated time, comfort, a lack of urgency. Many criminal profilers later pointed to these behaviors as evidence that the offender was not operating in a state of panic. The murders themselves had been violent, chaotic, physical. yet the actions afterwards appeared measured, almost routine. That contradiction became one of the defining features of the case. The same individual who committed an extraordinarily brutal attack also appeared capable of calmly remaining at the scene afterwards. How those two behaviours fit together remains unclear. Then there was the computer. For years, this detail shaped public understanding of the case. Records showed internet activity occurring after the estimated time of the murders. Investigators initially believed that the offender had used the family computer at approximately 1:18 a.m. Another event later that morning appeared to suggest activity around 10 a.m. If correct, the implication was extraordinary. The offender may have remained inside the residence for nearly 10 hours. Such behaviour would be exceptionally rare. It would suggest not merely confidence, but complete disregard for the possibility of discovery. As a result, the timeline became one of the most discussed aspects of the investigation. Books referenced it, documentaries highlighted it, journalists repeatedly returned to it. The image of a killer browsing the internet after committing murder became embedded in public memory. Years later, however, investigators would revisit that assumption. And when they did, they discovered that the evidence may not have meant what they originally thought. But at the beginning of the investigation, the computer records appeared to support one remarkable conclusion. The offender had stayed. While behavioral evidence generated questions, physical evidence generated opportunities. The attacker had left behind an extraordinary amount of material. Fingerprints, blood, footwear impressions, clothing, personal belongings. In many homicide investigations, detectives struggled to recover even a fraction of that amount. Here, evidence seemed almost abundant, yet abundance did not translate into identification. One of the most important discoveries involved DNA. Biological traces recovered from the scene belonged not only to the victims, but also to the offender. This provided investigators with a genetic profile. At first, this seemed enormously promising. DNA had already transformed criminal investigations around the world. Cases once considered impossible had been solved through biological evidence. The assumption was simple. If investigators possessed the offender's DNA, eventually they would identify the person responsible. But the years passed, and no match appeared. The profile remained in a database. Comparisons were conducted repeatedly. Nothing. The DNA confirmed the offender had been present. It confirmed injury, but it refused to reveal a name. As forensic science advanced, investigators revisited the biological evidence. New analysis suggested the offender's ancestry might be more complex than originally assumed. Rather than pointing clearly toward a single national background, the results suggested a mixed heritage. Interpretations varied. Some analysis indicated paternal ancestry potentially linked to East Asia, including Japanese, Korean, or Chinese populations. Maternal ancestry appeared to show possible links to southern European regions. Investigators were careful in how they presented these findings. DNA ancestry is not nationality. It is not identity. It cannot tell investigators where a person lives, nor can it identify an individual by itself. Yet the findings influenced how the case was viewed. Early assumptions had often centered on a local Japanese offender. Now, investigators were forced to consider broader possibilities. The evidence seemed to suggest somebody whose background might not fit neatly into a single category. And once again, rather than narrowing the field, the evidence expanded it. The offender's clothing generated similar frustration. Several items believed to belong to the attacker were recovered from the house. For investigators, this represented a rare opportunity. Clothing can reveal a surprising amount about a person. Brands can suggest purchasing habits. Sizes can provide estimates of build. Wear patterns can reveal lifestyle. Detectives traced manufacturers, reviewed sales records, examined distribution networks. The effort consumed enormous time and resources, yet the results proved disappointing. Most of the items were widely available commercial products. Nothing pointed clearly toward a specific individual. The clothing suggested a young, slim male. Beyond that, it revealed very little. Footwear evidence appeared more promising, though. Impressions recovered from the scene allowed investigators to identify the offender's shoes with unusual precision. The shoes had been manufactured in South Korea. More importantly, they were believed to have been distributed primarily within that market. Suddenly, the investigation expanded beyond Japan. Police worked with South Korean authorities. Records were reviewed, fingerprint databases were searched, potential leads were examined. For a time, investigators wondered whether the offender might have travelled from overseas, yet certainty remained elusive. Products move across borders, people travel. Ownership of a particular pair of shoes could not establish identity, and so another potentially important lead stalled. Then came one of the strangest discoveries of all. Soil. Tiny particles recovered from the offender's belongings became the subject of detailed forensic analysis. The findings were extraordinary. Some samples appeared consistent with the locations in Japan. Others suggested exposure to areas around Seoul. Additional traces indicated possible links to parts of the United States, including desert environments associated with Nevada. Further analysis identified mineral signatures linked to regions of California. The results fascinated investigators, but they also created confusion. How could a single individual have accumulated traces associated with so many geographically distant environments? Had the offender travelled extensively, worked internationally, been exposed through imported materials? No explanation could be proven. The soil evidence became symbolic of the entire investigation. Rich in information, poor in certainty. As detectives pursued forensic leads, reports began arriving from members of the public. Some seemed insignificant, others appeared potentially important. One of the most intriguing involved a man seeking treatment for a severe hand injury. The timing was striking. The injury was consistent with what investigators believed the offender had suffered. Yet despite considerable effort, the individual was never conclusively identified. Another report described a man with blood visible on his hand during the early hours after the murders. Again, the timing was suggestive, but again, no definitive connection could be established. Even a taxi driver's report generated attention. What initially appeared to be bloodstains on a seat ultimately proved to be chocolate. Lead after lead emerged, and lead after lead faded. Gradually, investigators found themselves confronting a frustrating reality. They were not lacking evidence. They were lacking convergence. Every clue pointed somewhere, but no two clues pointed to exactly the same place. By the middle of 2001, thousands of officers had worked the case. Thousands of leads had been examined, yet the central mystery remained intact. Whoever entered the Miyazawa home on the night of the 30th of December 2000 had left behind an extraordinary forensic trail, but somehow that trail still did not lead to a name. By the mid-2000s, the investigation had entered a new phase. The frantic search for an unknown offender had not ended, but it had changed. The first months of the case had been dominated by immediate questions. Who entered the house? Where had they gone afterwards? Could witnesses identify them? Had they sought medical treatment? Were they local? Or had they arrived from somewhere else entirely? As time passed without an arrest, those questions became more complicated. The evidence remained, the fingerprints remained, the DNA remained, the footwear impressions remained, but none of it had produced a suspect. And so investigators began returning to the evidence itself, not searching for new clues, just re-examining old ones, looking for details that might have been missed the first time. One of the most significant developments came through advances in DNA analysis. The biological evidence recovered from the crime scene had always been considered one of the strongest aspects of the investigation. Unlike many unsolved murders, the Setagaya case was not suffering from a lack of forensic material. Police possessed a DNA profile believed to belong to the offender. The problem was that the profile matched nobody. As technology improved, forensic specialists revisited the material. New techniques allowed investigators to extract information that had not been available in 2000. The results generated considerable attention. Analysis suggested the offender may have possessed a mixed ancestral background. Reports varied regarding the exact interpretation, but investigators concluded that the genetic picture was more complex than originally assumed. The findings did not identify a suspect, though, nor did they establish nationality. But they did challenge some of the assumptions that had developed during the early years of the investigation. For a long time, people had imagined the offender as a local resident who happened to know the area well. The newer DNA analysis suggested that the reality might not be so straightforward. The person responsible could have had a background spanning multiple regions and cultures. Once again, however, the evidence created possibilities rather than certainty, and the DNA told investigators something about the offender. Just not enough. The renewed forensic work also forced detectives to reconsider earlier theories. One of the most common assumptions had been that the offender possessed detailed local knowledge. After all, the route into the house suggested confidence. The surrounding redevelopments had created unusual conditions in the neighbourhood. The nearby park, that provided concealment. The offender appeared comfortable moving through the area. These factors seemed to point towards somebody familiar with Setagaya, yet other evidence pushed in a different direction. The South Korean footwear, the international environmental traces, the ancestry findings. Each hinted at a wider geographical story. Investigators found themselves caught between competing possibilities. Perhaps the offender was local. Perhaps they were not. Perhaps they had once lived nearby but travelled extensively. Or perhaps the apparent familiarity with the area had been exaggerated from the beginning. None of these possibilities could be ruled out, and none could be confirmed. As investigators revisited old evidence, another curious detail emerged. In April 2001, several months after the murders, a stone statue had been discovered near the Senkawa River. At first glance, it appeared unrelated. The object depicted a Jizo Bodhisattva, a Buddhist figure traditionally associated with the protection of children and travellers. The statue was carved from white granite and stood roughly 6 centimetres tall. What attracted attention was not merely its appearance, it was the timing. Investigators believed the statue had been placed at the location shortly before it was discovered. An unusual marking on its base also generated discussion. Police examined the object extensively. Photographs were distributed, public appeals were issued. More than 30,000 notices were circulated in an effort to determine where the statue had come from and who had placed it there. No answer ever emerged. No forensic evidence connected it directly to the murders. No witness came forward with information capable of explaining its appearance. Over time, the Jizo statue became one of the stranger footnotes in the case. Perhaps it was entirely unrelated. Perhaps it was significant. Like so many details in the Setagaya investigation, nobody could say for certain. By this point, alternative theories were beginning to flourish. Whenever a major case remains unsolved for years, speculation inevitably follows. The Setagaya murders were no exception. Writers, journalists, and independent researchers proposed increasingly varied explanations. Some suggested the offender had targeted the family specifically. Others argued the murders began as a burglary that escalated unexpectedly. There were theories involving organised crime, theories involving personal grudges, theories involving military connections, theories involving foreign nationals. Some writers attempted to identify specific suspects. Others claimed to have reconstructed the entire crime from beginning to end. The problem was that most of these theories depended heavily on interpretation, and interpretation is not evidence. Again and again, investigators found themselves responding to claims that could not be supported by forensic findings. The public fascination with the case continued to grow, but fascination did not bring resolution. In 2006, one publication generated particular controversy. A journalist released a book claiming to identify the offender and explain the motive behind the murders. The work attracted considerable attention. For a brief period, some readers believed the mystery might finally have been solved. Police disagreed. Investigators criticized the book heavily, arguing that many of its conclusions relied on speculation rather than evidence. Several claims contradicted established forensic findings. Others appeared to depend upon reconstructed conversations and events that could not be independently verified. The dispute highlighted a problem that would continue throughout the life of the case. The longer a mystery remains unsolved, the more space exists for narrative to replace evidence. And few cases created more narrative opportunities than Setagaya. As the years passed, the investigation gradually became less about discovering new evidence and more about understanding existing evidence. That distinction is important because the case was not cold in the traditional sense. Police still continued receiving information, new forensic techniques continued to be applied, and evidence continued to be reviewed. Yet the central challenge remained unchanged. Investigators possessed an extraordinary amount of material. What they lacked was a way to connect it all together. One detective later described the problem as a case of too much evidence pointing in different directions. The fingerprints suggested one thing, the footwear suggested another, the soil evidence suggested something else entirely. Every clue appeared important, but no clue completed the picture. Then came a development that changed how investigators viewed one of the most famous aspects of the case, the computer timeline. For years, it had been widely accepted that activity recorded later on the morning of the 31st of December. It indicated the offender remained inside the house for an exceptionally long period. The implication was extraordinary, a killer spending nearly 10 hours inside a crime scene. It was one of the details that captured public imagination. But in 2015, investigators revisited the evidence. The results were unexpected. The later computer activity may not have represented deliberate use at all. Instead, experts suggested it could have been triggered accidentally. Something as simple as movement of the mouse, a shift in position, an unintended activation of the system. If correct, the consequences were significant. One of the most important assumptions in the case was suddenly less certain. Perhaps that offender had not remained inside the house as long as people previously believed. Perhaps they had left much earlier. The revised interpretation did not solve the mystery, but it reminded investigators that even well-established conclusions can change when evidence is re-examined. As the 15th anniversary of the murders approached, another issue began attracting attention: the statute of limitations. At the time the murders occurred, Japanese law imposed a limitation period for homicide prosecutions. Unless an offender was identified and charged within that period, prosecution would eventually become impossible. For investigators, the approaching deadline created pressure, not only because of the practical implications, but because of the symbolism. The Miyazawa case had become one of Japan's most prominent unsolved murders. Allowing the legal window to close without an arrest would be deeply significant. In response, investigators launched renewed reviews of the evidence. Old leads were revisited, public appeals intensified, media coverage increased. The hope was that somebody somewhere might finally provide the missing piece. In December 2014, the reward for information was increased dramatically. The total eventually reached 20 million yen, one of the largest rewards offered in Japan for an unsolved homicide. The increase reflected both determination and urgency. Time was running out. Yet despite renewed publicity, no breakthrough arrived. The reward generated attention. It generated discussion, but it did not generate a suspect. Meanwhile, the house itself remained frozen in time. Unlike many crime scenes, the Miyazawa residence was preserved for years after the murders. As a result, the interior remained largely unchanged. Personal belongings were still present, furniture remained in place. Even markings made by the children on interior walls could still be seen. Visitors occasionally described the experience as unsettling, not because the house looked frightening, but because it looked normal. A family home interrupted, a life paused. Everything appeared as though its occupants might return at any moment, except they never would. Eventually, concerns emerged regarding the structure itself. Years of preservation had taken their toll. Authorities warned that the building was deteriorating, and demolition was proposed. Investigators argued that all the recoverable forensic material had already been documented. From a practical perspective, there was little evidential reason to keep the structure standing. But family members viewed the situation differently. For them, the house represented more than evidence. It represented memory, history, presence. The debate reflected a broader question surrounding the case itself. What exactly was being preserved? A crime scene? Or the final physical connection to a family whose lives had been stolen? Following changes to Japanese law, the legal framework surrounding the case also evolved. In 2010, Japan abolished the statute of limitations for murder. The reform reflected advances in forensic science and long-standing pressure from victims' families. Many believed that serious crimes should remain prosecutable regardless of how much time had passed. The Miyazawa case became one of the most frequently cited examples during discussions surrounding the reform. A crime rich in evidence, a crime still unsolved, a crime that seemed to demonstrate why time limits could be problematic. Yet, despite the legislative changes, the central mystery remained untouched. No arrest followed, no suspect emerged. The evidence remained exactly where it was, waiting. Today, the Setagaya family murders occupy a unique place in criminal history. The case is neither forgotten nor solved. Police continue to receive tips. Evidence remains preserved. Periodic reviews still occur. The reward remains in place, and every year, investigators renew their appeal for information. Yet the same fundamental question persists. Who entered the Miyazawa home on the night of the 30th of December, 2000? The offender left fingerprints, blood, DNA, footwear impressions, clothing, environmental traces, enough evidence to solve many investigations several times over. And still, no identity has been confirmed. No arrest has been made. No explanation has fully accounted for all of the evidence. More than 2 decades later, the case remains suspended between knowledge and uncertainty. Investigators know a great deal about what happened inside the house. They know remarkably little about the person who did it. And that contradiction is what continues to make the Setagaya murders so compelling. Because this is not a mystery defined by a lack of evidence. It is a mystery defined by an abundance of it. A crime scene overflowing with clues. A trail that seems to lead everywhere and nowhere. At the center of it all remains one unchanging fact. 4 members of the Miyazawa family lost their lives on a winter's night in Tokyo, and the person responsible has never been identified. This has been The Eclectic, a story not just about an unsolved crime, but about the limits of certainty, about how evidence can survive for decades and still refuse to tell a complete story, how every answer can create a new question, and how sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not the ones with no clues at all, but the ones with far too many. Because the Setagaya case isn't remembered simply because it remains unsolved. It's remembered because it challenges something we like to believe. That enough evidence will eventually reveal the truth. That every mystery can be untangled. That every trail leads somewhere. Yet here we are, more than 25 years later, still looking, still questioning, still wondering who walked away from that house and disappeared into history. This has been The Eclectic. If you found this story compelling, please follow, rate, and share the show. It helps others discover these deep dives into the strange corners of history. And if you have a family legend of your own, half truth, half ghost story, I'd love to hear it. This has been The Eclectic. Stay curious, stay questioning, and as always, stay eclectic.